The streetlights flickered on one by one as evening settled over the city, washing the pavement in a tired amber glow. At the back entrance of a glass tower, a man in a faded janitor's uniform locked up his cart and pulled on a worn jacket. His shoulders sagged like the day had been heavier than most. Across the street, inside a sleek black sedan, a woman rested her hands on the steering wheel, watching him through the windshield. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had never followed an employee home before. But something about the way he said goodbye to the security guard, soft, grateful, almost apologetic, made her stay. When he finally walked off into the dark, she turned the key and followed, unaware that this quiet decision would crack open a truth she was not ready to face. Before the story pulls you further, and take a moment and tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, or in the middle of noise and life? Drop your city in the comments. It's strange how a single story can travel across miles and still land softly in a stranger's heart. Ethan Carter walked the last 6 blocks home because the bus pass had expired again. The city hummed around him. Sirens in the distance, laughter spilling from a bar on the corner, but he moved through it like a shadow, eyes down, hands shoved into his pockets. His shoes were scuffed thin at the soles, letting the cold creep up with every step. He didn't notice the car that slowed behind him, nor the woman inside who kept a careful distance, her headlights dimmed. Grace Whitmore had spent her day in boardrooms and executive calls, signing papers that moved millions. She was the CEO of the very building Ethan cleaned every night. To most, she was sharp suits and sharper decisions. To herself, she was someone who had stopped looking closely at people a long time ago. Tonight, though, she couldn't explain the tight feeling in her chest as she watched Ethan pause at a crosswalk, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He turned down a narrower street, lined with aging apartment blocks and flickering porch lights. Grace's car rolled to a stop a block away. She parked, stepped out into the cold, and followed on foot, heels clicking too loudly before she slipped them off and carried them like an intruder in her own city. Ethan reached a squat brick building with a broken intercom and a door that didn't quite shut. Inside, the hallway smelled of old paint and something faintly sweet, like laundry soap. Grace hesitated at the entrance, then slipped in as the door swung back. She stayed on the stairs, heart pounding, feeling ridiculous and invasive, and unable to leave. From above, she watched him unlock an apartment and step inside. The door didn't close fully. Light spilled into the hall, and with it a small voice. "Dad." "I'm here, buddy," Ethan said, his voice changing instantly, lighter, warmer, like the day hadn't drained him at all. Grace froze. A little boy, maybe 6, ran into Ethan's arms. He was barefoot, hair sticking up, pajamas too short at the ankles. Ethan scooped him up with a quiet laugh, pressing his face into the child's shoulder. "Did you do your reading?" "Yes," the boy said proudly. "And Mrs. Chin gave me an apple. That's my guy." Grace's throat tightened. She leaned against the wall, unseen, as Ethan set the boy down and moved through the tiny kitchen. The place was clean but sparse. Second-hand table, a couch with a blanket draped over it, a stack of library books by the door. No toys scattered everywhere. No noise. Just careful order. Ethan poured cereal into 2 bowls, adding the last of the milk. He slid one to the boy. "Sorry, it's not pancakes. Tomorrow, okay?" The boy nodded, already eating. "It's okay. You worked late again." "Yeah," Ethan said softly, "but I'm here now." Grace felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the picture she'd unconsciously painted of him, the quiet janitor who never complained, who worked holidays without question. She had never asked why, never needed to. As she turned to leave, her foot brushed a loose stair tread. It creaked. Ethan looked up, instinct sharp despite exhaustion. "Hello." Grace's breath caught. She stepped into the light, suddenly exposed, shoes in hand, power and confidence stripped away. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I work with you. From the office." Ethan's eyes widened, confusion flickering across his face before he masked it. "Ms. Whitmore?" Grace nodded, heat rushing to her cheeks. "I shouldn't be here. I followed you, and that was wrong. She stopped, words failing as the boy peeked around Ethan's leg. This is Leo, Ethan said quietly, one hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. Grace swallowed. Hi, Leo. Leo waved with his spoon still in his hand. I'll go, Grace said quickly. I'm sorry. Truly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Okay. She left the building with her heart pounding harder than it ever had in a boardroom. In the cold night air, she stood still. The image burned into her mind. A tired man, a small boy, and a life balanced on the edge of quiet sacrifice. If you had been standing there with her, seeing that moment unfold, what would you have done? Would you have walked away or stayed to understand more? Share your honest thought in the comments. And if this scene stirred something in you, tap like to show that moments of quiet humanity still matter. Grace didn't sleep that night. The city outside her penthouse windows glittered like nothing was wrong, like comfort erased consequences. She lay awake replaying the scene in that small apartment, the way Ethan's shoulders finally relaxed when his son hugged him, the careful way he measured the milk so it would last. It gnawed her, not as pity, but as something sharper. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. At dawn, she was already dressed, standing in her kitchen with a cup of untouched coffee. She'd built her career on discipline, on never letting emotion blur decisions. Yet here she was, unsettled by a man who cleaned her building after everyone else went home. At work, Grace watched Ethan from a distance. He arrived early, as always, pushing his cart with methodical precision. He greeted the receptionist by name, fixed a flickering light without being asked, picked up a coffee someone had spilled before it dried into the carpet. No one noticed. Or maybe they were simply used to him being there, useful, invisible. Grace called human resources before lunch. Pull up Ethan Carter's file, she said, keeping her voice even. Just basic employment history. Minutes later, the information sat on her screen. Widowed, one dependent, no disciplinary issues. Overtime logged almost every week. Pay, minimum wage plus small night differential. Widowed. The words settled heavy in her chest. That afternoon, she found herself in the elevator with him. The door slid shut, trapping them in polite silence. Ethan nodded respectfully. Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore. Grace, she said before she could stop herself. Please. He blinked, surprised. Okay, Grace. The elevator hummed. She searched for something neutral to say. Your son, Leo. How old is he? 6, Ethan replied, cautious but not unfriendly. First grade. Smart kid, she said. He seemed kind. Ethan smiled then, real and unguarded. He gets that from his mom. The smile faded just as quickly. The doors opened. Ethan stepped out, then hesitated. About last night, I'd appreciate it if... I understand, Grace said quickly. I won't cross that line again. I promise. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. As he walked away, Grace felt the distance between their worlds more clearly than ever. She could help him. A raise. A bonus. She could write a check and be done with it. But something told her that wouldn't be enough. Over the next week, she noticed more. Ethan declined after-work drinks with coworkers, always glancing at his phone around the same time every night. She overheard him asking the security desk if any extra shifts were available on weekends. Once, she saw him discreetly counting coins at a vending machine before deciding against buying anything. And then there was the school call. Grace happened to be passing the lobby when Ethan rushed in, breathless, panic written across his face. I need to leave, he told the supervisor. My son's sick. They think it might be pneumonia. The supervisor frowned, checking the schedule. We're short tonight. I know, Ethan said, voice tight. I'll make it up. I swear. Grace stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. He can go, she said. I'll cover the shift. Both men stared at her. You don't have to, Ethan said. I know, Grace replied. But you should be with your son. Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes shining with something like relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, then ran. Grace spent the evening pushing a mop through hallways she usually only walked in polished shoes. The work was harder than it looked. Her arms ached. Her back protested. But with every step, she thought of a small boy coughing in a hospital bed, waiting for his dad. Have you ever had someone step in for you when life felt unbearable, when you didn't even know how to ask? If yes, type yes and share their name. Sometimes gratitude deserves to be spoken aloud. Leo was admitted overnight. Grace learned this the next morning when she called the hospital under the pretense of checking on an employee emergency. She sat in her office afterward, staring at the city again, realizing how close kindness and neglect could sit side by side. She visited the hospital that evening, this time openly. The children's ward smelled of disinfectant and hope trying its best. She brought a small bag, books, a puzzle, a stuffed dinosaur she'd bought without thinking. Ethan looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "Grace," he said softly when he saw her. "You didn't have to come." "I wanted to," she replied. Leo grinned weakly from the bed. "Hi." "Hi," Grace said, kneeling so they were eye level. "I brought you a friend." She handed him the dinosaur. His eyes lit up. "Dad." "He's green." Ethan laughed quietly, then turned serious. "Thank you. For everything." "I don't know how to." "Just focus on him," Grace said. "That's enough." As she left the hospital, the weight in her chest shifted again. Not lighter, but clearer. This wasn't about charity. It was about responsibility. About seeing someone fully and choosing not to look away. She didn't yet know how far that choice would take her, or how much it would cost them both. Leo came home 3 days later, thinner and quieter, but smiling when Ethan carried him up the apartment stairs. Grace watched from the hallway, having insisted on driving them back herself. The ride had been mostly silent, broken only by Leo naming every car color he saw. Ethan thanked her again, his voice low, like gratitude was something he didn't want to burden her with. Life returned to its rhythm, but not quite. Grace couldn't unsee what she'd seen. She couldn't unknow the fragile balance Ethan lived on. She began finding reasons to cross paths with him. Casual conversations, asking about Leo's school, recommending a doctor she trusted. Nothing dramatic, just presence. Ethan, for his part, kept his guard up. He was polite, appreciative, but careful. He'd learned what hope cost when it broke. One evening, as winter deepened, the building lost power during a storm. Employees gathered in the lobby, flashlights cutting through darkness. Ethan worked steadily, guiding people down the stairs, calming a nervous intern, helping an older accountant who'd twisted her ankle. Grace watched him move. Quiet leadership, no hesitation. Later, as they waited for the generators to stabilize, Grace offered him a cup of coffee from a thermos she'd brought down. He accepted, hands shaking slightly from the cold. "You're good with people," she said. Ethan shrugged. "You learn when you have to be." They stood side by side, steam rising between them. "Can I ask you something personal?" Grace said. He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Why don't you ask for help?" The question landed softly, but firmly. Ethan stared into his coffee. "Because help usually comes with an end date," he said after a moment. "Or a price." Grace absorbed that. "Not always." He looked at her then, eyes tired but sharp. That's easy to believe when you've never had it disappear. The power flickered back on. The moment passed, but the word stayed. Weeks later, Grace made a decision that blurred every line she'd drawn before. She requested a meeting with Ethan, not as his boss, but as a person. They sat in a small cafe near the school. Leo colored at the table, dinosaur tucked under his arm. "I want to offer you something," Grace said carefully. "And you can say no." Ethan stiffened. "What kind of something?" "A different role," she said. "Facilities coordinator. Better hours, better pay, benefits that actually help." Ethan's first instinct was suspicion. Why? Grace didn't dodge it. "Because you're already doing the job. And because I ignored people like you for too long." Silence stretched. Leo looked up. "Dad, can I get a cookie?" Ethan smiled faintly. "In a minute." He turned back to Grace. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, she said. It's correction. He exhaled slowly. I need time.
Take it, she said.
All the time you need. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of Leo's bed long after the boy fell asleep. The promotion letter lay folded in his pocket, heavy as a promise. He thought of his wife, of how she believed in kindness even when it hurt. He thought of Grace, standing in a hallway with a mop, doing work she didn't have to do. And for the first time in years, he wondered if accepting help was a kind of courage too. Now it's your turn. Share one small good thing you've done recently, even if no one noticed. Write it below so others remember that humanity still lives in quiet acts. Your story might light someone's path tonight. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and unassuming, covering the city without asking permission. Inside that small apartment, Ethan finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life was shifting. But neither he nor Grace could see the storm still waiting ahead, the truth that would test everything they were building together. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, slicing through Grace's schedule without mercy. Ms. Whitmore, the voice on the line said, "This is St. Anne's Medical Center. We're calling about Ethan Carter." Grace's pen stilled mid-signature. What happened? There was a pause, never a good sign. He collapsed at work. Severe exhaustion. We're running tests. Grace was already standing, code in hand before the call ended. At the hospital, the hallway lights felt harsher than before. She found him in a curtained room, pale against white sheets, and 4 taped to his arm. A doctor spoke quietly nearby, words drifting toward her like cold rain. Malnutrition, untreated anemia, prolonged stress. Grace felt her chest tighten. All the signs she'd noticed. All the times she'd walked past without truly seeing. Ethan opened his eyes when he sensed her. "Hey," he said hoarsely. "Guess I finally overdid it." "You shouldn't joke," Grace replied, voice trembling despite herself. He tried to sit up and failed. "Leo?" "He's okay," she said quickly. "He's with Mrs. Chin." Relief washed over his face. Then shame followed. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I know," Grace said softly, "but it did." The doctor cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said. "We found older records. Your wife, she passed from the same condition, didn't she?" Ethan closed his eyes. Grace felt the world tilt. Outside the room, the truth spilled out in fragments. Ethan's wife, Lily, had worked 2 jobs while sick, refusing treatment because they couldn't afford it. By the time she collapsed, it was too late. Ethan had promised himself he'd never let Leo suffer the same way. So he skipped meals, took extra shifts, ignored symptoms. Survival had become a habit that was slowly killing him. Grace returned to the room and sat beside the bed. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Ethan's voice cracked. "Because last time I trusted the system, it failed her." Silence pressed in, heavy and unforgiving. "I followed you that night," Grace said suddenly, "because I thought I saw someone invisible. I didn't realize how deep that invisibility went." Ethan looked at her then, really looked. "I didn't need saving," he said quietly. "I just needed a chance." Grace nodded, tears finally breaking free. "And you should have had it." The hospital days blurred together. Grace rearranged meetings, canceled trips. She brought Leo every evening, watched him curl beside his father, Dinosaur tucked under his chin. She listened to Ethan talk, not about hardship, but about Lily. Her laugh. Her stubborn hope. One evening, Ethan handed Grace a folded paper. "I never showed anyone this," he said. It was a letter Lily had written before she died. About forgiveness. About letting people in. About not confusing strength with silence. Grace read it with shaking hands. "I think," Ethan said, "I was afraid that if I accepted help, I'd be admitting she died for nothing." Grace met his eyes. "Or maybe you'd be honoring her by choosing life." The words settled between them like a bridge. When Ethan was discharged, Grace didn't just walk him to the car. She walked him into a future she was determined to help protect. Insurance paperwork expedited. Back pay adjusted. A foundation quietly established, one that ensured no employee under her company would ever have to choose between health and survival again. But the biggest shift wasn't corporate. It was personal. The night Ethan returned home, he stood in his apartment, overwhelmed by how close he'd come to losing everything. Grace lingered by the door. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "But if you ever feel yourself slipping back into that place, let someone know. Let me know." Ethan nodded slowly. "I will." As Grace stepped into the hallway, emotion finally caught up with her. She pressed her hand to her mouth, breath shaking. If that revelation, the cost of silent suffering, hit you hard, leave a red heart below. Sometimes a single symbol can carry the weight of everything our hearts are trying to say. Behind her, Ethan closed the door gently, Leo's laughter echoing through the thin walls. And for the first time since Lily's death, the apartment felt less like a place of endurance and more like a place of healing. But healing, Grace would soon learn, did not mean the absence of pain. It meant facing the hardest question of all, what forgiveness really costs when the wounds are this deep. The letter haunted Grace. Lily's words followed her through meetings, through late-night drives, through the quiet moments when the city finally slept. Don't confuse strength with silence. It felt like an accusation and a confession at the same time. Grace had built an empire by rewarding silence, by praising those who endured without complaint. Ethan was not an exception. He was the result. A week after Ethan returned to work, on reduced hours, under strict medical orders, Grace called an all-hands meeting. The auditorium filled with murmurs and tired faces. Janitors stood beside managers. Security guards beside analysts. No hierarchy, just people. Grace stepped to the podium, the lights bright and unforgiving. She took a breath. "I failed," she said. The room stilled. "For years, I measured success by output," Grace continued. "By profit margins and efficiency. I told myself that if someone needed help, they would ask. I was wrong." Eyes drifted toward Ethan, seated near the back, Leo's drawing peeking out of his bag. Grace didn't name him. She didn't need to. She announced new policies, health coverage without waiting periods, emergency support funds, anonymous assistance channels. But more than that, she spoke about listening, about noticing, about responsibility that went beyond spreadsheets. The applause at the end was hesitant at first. Then it grew. Ethan watched, conflicted. Gratitude tangled with discomfort. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a father who came home healthy. After the meeting, he waited until the hallway cleared before approaching Grace. "You didn't have to make it public." "I did," she said gently. "Because silence thrives in private." He nodded, absorbing that. Later that night, Ethan sat with Leo at the kitchen table, helping with homework. Leo looked up suddenly. "Dad, are you going to be okay now?" Ethan swallowed. "I think so." "Because you have help?" Leo asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "Because I have help." Leo smiled, satisfied, and went back to writing his letters. The next test came quietly. A letter arrived from Lily's parents. Ethan hadn't heard from them in years. Not since the hospital bills, not since the arguments about treatment, not since blame turned love into something sharp. His hands shook as he opened it. "We heard you were ill," it read. "We didn't know. We're sorry. We want to see Leo." Old anger surged. Old grief. The memory of standing alone at Lily's grave while they stood across the cemetery, eyes hard with accusation. Ethan folded the letter, chest tight. That evening, he told Grace about it as they walked through the now familiar streets. "They blamed me," he said, "for not pushing harder, for not saving her." Grace stopped walking. "And what do you want?" "I want to protect my son," Ethan said. "From confusion, from reopening wounds, and yourself." Grace asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Forgiveness felt like another demand, another thing he was expected to give for someone else's peace. They stood there, streetlights humming overhead. "Be honest," Grace said. "Could you forgive them after everything?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It cut straight to the bone. Ethan stared at the pavement. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to. Part of me feels like it would erase what Lily went through. Grace nodded. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It just decides what you carry forward. That night, Ethan sat alone, Lily's letter in one hand, her parents' letter in the other. Two paths. Neither easy. Be honest with yourself. Could you forgive after being hurt that deeply? Type forgive if you think you could, or never if it would break you too much. There's no wrong answer here. Only truth. Days passed without a decision. Then one afternoon, Leo came home from school with a drawing. It showed 3 figures holding hands, one with wings. That's Mommy, Leo said simply. She's watching. Something in Ethan cracked open. He called Lily's parents that night. The meeting was awkward, raw, full of pauses and tears that came too late. But when Leo ran into his grandparents' arms without fear, Ethan felt a weight shift, not disappear, but move. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't for them. It was for the life still growing in front of him. As winter began to loosen its grip, something fragile but real took root.
Trust. Community.
A future not built on endurance alone. Grace watched it unfold with quiet awe, understanding now that redemption was not a grand gesture. It was a series of brave, imperfect choices made when walking away would have been easier. Spring arrived quietly, like it didn't want to disturb anything still healing. The snow melted into thin rivers along the sidewalks, and sunlight lingered a little longer each evening. Ethan noticed the change first in Leo. How he ran instead of walked, how his cough disappeared, how laughter came easier. Life no longer felt like something they were outrunning. Ethan settled into his new role with cautious gratitude. The hours were humane. The paycheck, finally enough. But more than that, there was dignity. People came to him with problems now, not because he was invisible, but because he was trusted. Grace watched him from a distance, careful not to hover. She'd learned that support didn't mean control. Some mornings, she found a note on her desk, "Fix the leak on floor 12, signed simply E." It made her smile every time. One afternoon, the building hosted a small spring fair for employees' families. Nothing extravagant. Food trucks, face paint, folding tables under blooming trees. Grace stood back as Leo tugged Ethan toward a balloon artist. Lily's parents were there too, hovering awkwardly at first, then laughing as Leo showed them his painted tiger face. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer dominated the present. Grace felt something unfamiliar swell in her chest.
Peace.
She joined Ethan near the edge of the crowd. "You did this," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "We did." They stood in companionable silence, watching Leo chase bubbles that floated like fragile promises into the air. "You ever think about how close it all came to ending differently?" Ethan asked. "All the time," Grace admitted. "And yet here we are. Here we are." The words settled deep. Not triumphant. Not loud. Just true. Later that evening, as the fair wound down, the power briefly flickered, an echo of that winter night months ago. Instinctively, Ethan moved to help, but the lights steadied almost immediately.
Leo laughed.
"Dad, it's okay." Ethan stopped, realizing something had changed. He didn't need to brace for collapse anymore. That night, after Leo fell asleep, Ethan sat on the couch holding Lily's letter again. It no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a guide. He placed it in a small frame beside Leo's bed. Grace, across the city, sat at her kitchen table with her laptop closed. For once, there was nothing urgent demanding her attention. She thought of all the years she'd chased growth without grounding, success without soul. She'd gained something she hadn't known she was missing: connection. The next week, Grace announced the foundation publicly, not with fanfare, but with intention. Stories began to surface. Quiet ones. People who'd struggled alone now stepping forward, encouraged not by policy, but by proof. By Ethan. He never asked to be a symbol, but hope often chooses ordinary people. One evening, Ethan found Grace in the lobby after hours. "I wanted to thank you," he said. She smiled softly. "You've thanked me enough."
"No," he said.
"Not for the job. For seeing me before it was too late." Grace met his eyes. "Thank you for letting yourself be seen." Outside, the city breathed, cars passing, lights glowing, lives intersecting in ways no one could fully predict. If you believe that love still wins, that kindness can change the direction of a life, comment Amen below. Let's fill this moment with hope. Someone scrolling right now might need to see it. Grace watched Ethan walk away, shoulders lighter than the man she'd followed months ago. She understood now that redemption wasn't about fixing people. It was about standing beside them long enough for them to stand again on their own. And somewhere in the quiet space between who they had been and who they were becoming, both of them felt it. The rare, steady warmth of a future finally earned. But before this story could close, there was one last truth waiting to be spoken, one final reminder of why these moments matter at all. The letter arrived without warning, slipped under Grace's office door on a quiet Friday evening when most of the building had already emptied. No return address. Just her name, written carefully. Grace hesitated before opening it. Something in her chest tightened, the same instinct she'd learned to trust since the night she followed Ethan home. Inside was a single page. "I don't know if you remember me," it began. "I was one of the cleaners who worked nights before Ethan. I left without notice last year. I was ashamed. I didn't think anyone would care." Grace sat down slowly. The letter went on to explain how the woman, Maria, had been caring for her mother while hiding a diagnosis of her own. How she'd skipped shifts to sit in hospital rooms, then quit before anyone could fire her. How she'd heard, through former coworkers, that things had changed. That someone had finally noticed. "I saw what you did for him," the letter ended. "And because of that, I asked for help this time. I'm still here." Grace closed her eyes, breath unsteady. This was the ripple she hadn't fully understood before. Not policies. Not speeches. Proof. That evening, Grace drove past the old apartment building again. She didn't stop this time. She didn't need to. Lights glowed warmly behind the windows, and somewhere inside, a life was being lived without fear pressing against every breath. Ethan was on the floor with Leo, helping him assemble a model spaceship. Lily's parents sat on the couch, quietly bickering over directions. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't painless. But it was real. Ethan caught sight of Lily's framed letter by the bed and felt something close to peace. Not because the past had softened, but because it no longer owned him. Later, after Leo fell asleep, Ethan stepped out onto the fire escape, cool night air filling his lungs. He thought about how close he'd come to disappearing, how easily the world could have gone on without noticing, and how one person had chosen to look twice. Across the city, Grace stood by her window again, but this time, she wasn't restless. She wasn't searching. She was simply present. She understood now that leadership wasn't about standing above. It was about walking beside long enough for someone else to find their footing. The city lights flickered, steady and constant. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. It always did. But tonight, there was something rarer than success. There was meaning. And as the quiet settled in both their lives, the story drew close to its final breath, ready to leave behind not a lesson shouted, but a truth gently placed into waiting hands. The night the foundation held its first quiet gathering, no cameras were invited, no press releases, no speeches meant to impress. Just a circle of chairs in the same building where everything had once been overlooked. Grace arrived early, setting out cups of coffee herself. She wore no tailored suit tonight, just a soft sweater, sleeves rolled up. One by one, people filtered in. A security guard who'd slept in his car for months. A receptionist caring for a brother with special needs. A former cleaner, hands trembling, eyes cautious with hope. Ethan came last, Leo's hand in his. Grace noticed how different he looked now, not richer, not louder, just steadier. Like someone whose feet were finally planted on solid ground. They sat together. No podium. No hierarchy. People spoke when they were ready. Some cried. Some laughed nervously. Some just listened, relieved to finally be in a room where survival didn't have to be hidden. When it was Ethan's turn, he didn't stand. I used to think being strong meant handling everything alone, he said quietly. I thought if I stopped, everything would fall apart. His voice wavered, but he didn't stop. I was wrong. What almost broke me wasn't weakness. It was silence. Leo squeezed his hand. Ethan looked at Grace, not with debt, not with awe, but with equal humanity. Someone saw me, he said, and instead of walking past, she stayed. Grace felt her throat tighten. When the gathering ended, people lingered. No one rushed to leave, as if stepping back into the world felt less frightening when you knew you weren't invisible anymore. Later, as the last chair was folded away, Grace and Ethan stood by the windows together. The city hummed below them, unchanged, relentless, alive. You didn't just change policies, Ethan said. You changed direction. Grace shook her head. You did. I just followed. They shared a quiet smile, one without promises, without expectation. Just respect. Just understanding. Outside, Leo pressed his face to the glass. Dad, he said softly, the lights look like stars. Ethan knelt beside him. Yeah, they do. Grace watched them and felt the full weight of the journey settle into something gentle. This was why it mattered. If this story moved you, please don't scroll past quietly. Tap like, not for me, but for the man who carried silent pain and still chose kindness, for the child who never stopped believing, and for every person who feels unseen right now. One click can be your way of saying, I felt you. You mattered. Grace turned away from the window, ready to step back into her life, not as the woman she had been, but as someone changed by a single choice to look closer. Ethan took Leo's hand and headed home, heart lighter, future open. And somewhere, unseen but real, Lily's words lived on, not as grief, but as guidance. Because sometimes the greatest leadership isn't found in power. It's found in the courage to see one tired man walking home in the dark, and choosing not to look away.